Today, we're going to be speaking with Greg Tucker Kellogg, who's a biology professor at the National University of Singapore. He also has a YouTube channel addressing scientific misinformation on social media, of which there is a lot right now. Really great to have you on, Greg. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So I want to
pleasure.
eventually work towards ivermectin, which you've been talking about quite a bit on your channel. But maybe first we could talk a little bit about, since the early days in the pandemic, there have been these kind of clusters of treatment ideas that are proposed. And I want to be careful how I describe them, because just because something is proposed as a treatment doesn't mean it is a treatment for COVID. And early on, it was hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, maybe vitamin D, although vitamin D was, I think, proposed more prophylactically than some of these other things, and eventually ivermectin was added to the list. Generally speaking, my idea has been that most of the proposed so-called treatments are cheap, ubiquitous things which are mostly available in much of the world, and that so in some sense it makes sense that we would at least ask, might these things be useful? Is that a fair assessment of how some of these things start?
Absolutely. So there's a whole area of drug discovery and drug development that's referred to as drug repurposing. And so the idea is to take drugs that are available for other purposes and to see if they can be repurposed and found utility in something like an emergency like COVID. And so there were lots of tests around the world and actually large screening programs. There was a fairly large screening program at the NIH, for example, that was screening through approved drugs to see whether they would have activity in various viral assays. And those screening programs eventually, they generated some interest and there were some follow-ups. But yeah, there's a lot of interest in seeing whether some of those things can be used. And of course, steroid treatments are now a mainstay of treatment for COVID-19. So some of that has been really, really useful.
When this is done, are really expensive drugs sometimes tested? And what I mean by that is, I haven't heard of expensive cancer drugs being tested to see, might that work for COVID, for example? I mean, is it typically the cheap stuff?
Well, it's typically everything that's approved, because one of the things one would like to be able to do with a drug in particular is to be able to skip the safety trials. So if you already know that it's safe, then that's fine. But actually, in the case of cancer, a lot of traditional cancer drugs are like chemotherapeutics are effectively poisonous, and so it's not so much the price, but there are other reasons not to give them to say a COVID patient.
So in terms of the appropriate way to determine whether a drug works to treat a disease like COVID, in the last 2 years, we've seen every iteration from a French doctor gave hydroxychloroquine to 38 people, and here's sort of like his sense of how they did, all the way to some actual randomized controlled trials for ivermectin, comparing it to the standard of care versus a placebo, et cetera. So talk a little bit about sort of like the ideal formulation of the way we would test something for COVID.
Sure. Well, I'll speak to the drug discovery and clinical trial aspects of it. So when one does, drug discovery, when one does clinical trials, you like to treat or to test new drugs or drugs for a new purpose in a way that is relevant. So sometimes it might be preclinical studies, screening for large numbers, and then as you get to more expensive studies like clinical trials, you move to smaller groups. So there's some of the most important trials in this have been what they call platform trials, where they're looking at a large number of different agents. So the Together trial, for example, is such a platform trial, and they look at a number of agents. There's been some really good things that have come out with this, but it's not just, it's not just everything in the kitchen sink. You have to, make choices judiciously with the evidence that you have and move forward with the things that have the most promise.
In general, when we're 2 years into this pandemic, there is somewhat of an accepted standard of care for how moderate to severe COVID is treated in hospital settings. So if we want to introduce the idea of measuring the effect of something like ivermectin, would we always be testing it against the standard of care rather than against nothing, because few people would just get nothing?
Sure.
Is that an important aspect of this?
Yeah. So right. So in clinical trials, there's a principle of equipoise where you don't want to give an inferior treatment. Ethically, you want to know that you're giving at least the standard of care. Obviously, if there is no standard of care, then that's another situation. But if you have a standard of care, you want to be giving it. Also, of course, as over the last year, as a lot of people have gotten vaccinated, and as people have had prior infections, so there's some protection from immunity. And that also complicates trials. There's lots of things that complicate trials over time, but certainly you want to give, you don't want to deny the standard of care to somebody in a clinical trial.
And again, in an ideal formulation with something like ivermectin, would you really want three groups? One group that is just the standard of care group and everybody knows they're not receiving ivermectin. And then you would have a placebo group and an ivermectin group, and they don't know whether they are receiving the ivermectin. Would that be the ideal setup?
So in the first case that you're talking about, where people know, so it's generally two groups. It's two arms in one particular setting, even of a platform trial. So in
Fair.
A platform trial, they might be looking at multiple different settings. But you want to be able to compare the people who are getting the standard of care and the people who are getting the standard of care, and then maybe some new agent.
Fair. A few weeks ago, you did a great interview with Yakov Efimenko about a study or conference abstract, as maybe it's better referred to, on ivermectin. I did a much less detailed segment on that. And this was one that really caught fire. Everybody from Jordan Peterson to Dr. John Campbell, who I don't say this pejoratively, he's not a medical doctor. I feel driven to say that because there's some confusion about his credentials. Initially said, wow, 70% reduction in mortality for people given ivermectin. You extensively broke that down, including with one of the authors of the conference abstract, who said this was retrospective observational data. We don't know about dosing. The groups weren't separated by vaccine status. There's all these other problems with this. Why do you think that caught such fire on social media? Because the result was just notable and it made a great headline?
Yeah. So, I'm learning a lot about how this misinformation train works. And ivermectin seems to be the grift that keeps on grifting. And so what happens is, in this case, it was just a conference abstract, but it had this kind of startling result, or a result that could be spun in a way that was startling and seemed dramatic. And so that little thing gets amplified into something much larger. And then the results that are presented in the conference abstract were then taken way out of context and misrepresented in other ways. And all the limitations of the conference abstract, which led to it not being published, they weren't talked about. And so it just seemed like it was something much, much larger, much more definitive than it was. And that is what keeps happening over and over again.
I I think one of the sad things about this is it's very easy to say this stuff has become politicized. And in a certain sense, it has. But I'm not aware of people who don't want ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or the Z-Paks to work. I mean, I would love it if we had evidence that something really cheap and widely available was effective. So I feel like it's not uniformly or symmetrically politicized. I just want to be able to say, we have or we don't have evidence that this works. But it really does seem, particularly here in the United States, that there are people who attach to any one of these ideas and they almost stop caring about what the data show.
Yeah, so it's frustrating. So I'm not a medical doctor either. I'm a scientist. I'm a biologist, a biophysicist by training.
Yes.
And it's frustrating because what's happening in this case is that people are latching onto these, and then they're latching onto things that have not been shown to be effective, instead of moving forward with things that are effective, that have been shown to be effective. And that's the real tragedy of this, because they keep latching onto it. And I think it's actually not just, I wouldn't say it's a failure of science. So in the case of Efimenko, it was not a failure of science. Science worked. They decided not to publish the paper. But it was a terrible failure of science communication. And that's what keeps happening. So the misuse tends to exploit the ignorance of people about how science communication works and kind of widens that gap. So people don't know what a conference abstract is. And then they take that lack of knowledge, the public lack of knowledge, and just, build on it.
In thinking back now to that earlier list that I mentioned of ideas that there were early in the pandemic, and if you're not prepared to go into this, that's fine. I'm kind of springing this on you. It seems that the vitamin D piece has had some favorable results where, compared to a placebo, generally speaking, the correct level of vitamin D has a generally protective effect. It's not a treatment for COVID, but it seems as though what we suspected about vitamin D, that if your level is low, you're more susceptible to illness, that seems to have been confirmed, right? I mean, that seems one of the early things we learned.
So I think there was a lot of there was a lot of conflicting data on this as well. There were encouraging signs, but there was just a large study published, I think within the last week. And I have the study on my to-read list, but I haven't read it. And it doesn't show any benefit
it doesn't.
For vitamin D. Yeah, so it's a negative result for vitamin D.
And is that for supplementation generally, or just looking at if you're deficient versus you're not, you might be better or worse off?
So this is where I wish I had read the study now.
Right.
I haven't read the study, so I don't want to misspeak on that.
Fair. But that seems to be a fundamental question, I guess, that should be answered.
Yeah. So in the case of vitamin D, I think the argument had been that perhaps a deficiency would have been something to address. But then that doesn't mean anything about supplementation.
Right.
So if you're not deficient, then supplementation wouldn't necessarily be assumed to have any benefit. And in this case, I honestly haven't read the study results, so I don't want to misrepresent it.
You teach in Singapore. I'm curious if you can kind of give us some insights as to whether the entire media and social media landscape around these discussions is different there than in the United States, which it has been completely out of control and rife with misinformation and disinformation. What's the sort of feel there of these discussions?
In social media or the news media?
Either that you feel comfortable commenting on.
Sure. Well, I mean, the news media is pretty tame here, so there's not much in the news media. In the social media, there's been some. There's actually been a pro Ivermectin group, and as often happens, the fellow travelers in this tend to be anti-vax, and so they've been pro Ivermectin, anti-vax, anti-mandate, and some of them have gotten into legal trouble, and they've used social media, Telegram groups, Facebook groups, and so on to basically work to do their work and spread their message. And in fact, in some sense, that's how I got into this, because somebody had been influenced by these groups and asked me for help, asked me to help her understand these things, and kind of ultimately she ended up getting a vaccine, but it took a while.
Well, the YouTube channel is excellent. You really break these things down in a way that is both detailed but also accessible, which I think is so important right now when we talk about science communication. I want to suggest to everybody in my audience, check out Greg Tucker Kellogg's YouTube channel. Greg is a biology professor at the National University of Singapore. Really appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks very much, David. Really nice talking to you.